Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar, Standardized Assets. And the session for today is called How to Establish a Proper Coding Sequence. My name is Carla Cruz. I'll be your host today and we're joined by our presenter, Ernesto Perez. Before we continue, I would like to mention that we will have time at the end of today's session to answer any question, but please submit them anytime in the Q panel on the right side of your screen. Ernesto Perez is a specialist in asset management solutions with more than 5 years of experience consulting and implementing business solutions, especially in for EAM in the US and the Caribbean. So thank you for your time and your interest, and let's start.
Hello, everyone. Today, we're going to be talking about standardized assets and how to establish a proper coding sequence based on these parameters. My name is Ernesto Perez. I've been with Visual K for a little bit over 3 years. I started with Visual at a functional consulting side. And then I moved into the sales side. So I've learned a lot about the technical side of how EAM works, but I've also learned a lot about customer needs. So let's get to the presentation. So today, what we're going to be talking about is why use standardized codes and what's the benefit of it, right? So let's start with the why, and then what is the actual standard asset coding. And then we're going to look at a little bit of how different guidelines and parameters are used at this point and how we can apply them to the asset coding so we can start using those in our favor. And then we're going to see a little bit more about how we can standardize other sides of the company. And also we're going to look at what to do, or at least cover an introduction to what's next in terms of, now that you have your standard codes, what can you do with them? And by the way, this is a 2-part webinar. So today we're going to do a little bit of an introduction into what the actual standard codes are. And then next week, one of our colleagues is going to show a little bit more in depth of what you can do with it. So first off, why standardize asset coding, right? So there's a couple of reasons to that, and I'm sure you'll find another bunch of them. But for the first part, it establishes a format that you can basically use, obviously for your current assets, but you can also have your team instructed in such a way that the discipline continues for future assets and future purchases. Now, on a company-wide standpoint, you can have a visibility, and maybe if you have your management level, which are not probably going through the floor and understanding each asset, they can, just by having a glimpse of the actual code, they can have an understanding of what's the asset that we're talking about and how they may be impacting your asset management, right? Now, the other thing you can do is, now that you have standard codes, you are able to measure and compare, for example, different brands of the same equipment and say, okay, so this particular valve, for example, is being faulty when compared to the other, to brand X, and you can see performance, you can see maintenance information, and you can say, okay, so next time on, we can purchase another set of assets that are proven to work better for us, right? So those type of decisions are available once you have standardized coding. Also, during requisition or during your work request, you can have a simplified asset selection. We've had customers that kind of get confused when there's a large hierarchy and they see they see that they're different assets and they don't really know which one to select. So in this case, what we can see is the way we can track it and specify what's the actual equipment that is doing something wrong, or whatever the reason is for the requisition, is the actual asset that the technician needs to go out and check. The other thing that we are, like I said, this is going to be on next week's webinar, but it's going to be an in-depth analysis of what these standards are, right? So before we move on, when we talk about in-depth analysis, we can start thinking about, okay, so if we do a standardized code, then that can open the doors to another set of modules or functionalities that we perhaps couldn't when we were doing just a standard, or if you're using a sequential number for your codes, then that's not as easy to use, for example, artificial intelligence. So let's look a little bit more about what the actual standard asset is, right? So of course you have your assets and you have a lot of information within the record, but the purpose of having a standard asset coding is so that you can see, without going a lot into the detail, you can see, okay, so from what I'm seeing in this code, then I can just tell it's a valve or is it a pump or whatever it is, so that you can distinguish your assets just by looking at them, right? And for example, some of the asset information that you can get in this particular coding, and of course this is one set of standards which you can use as guidelines, but there are others. So in this particular asset coding, you can perhaps look at the location of the equipment, understand what type of equipment is, and understand a little bit more about the hierarchy. Now, different sites may contain the same asset more than one time, right? So you may have a lot of pumps, a lot of valves, a lot of them are doing exactly the same functionality, but you know where on what equipment they are working at. And of course, you know, if you have more than one in the same equipment, that you can have a tracking of which one is which, right? And we'll see in an example that I have here that you can see that the hierarchy drills down. So I have in this example basically the structure of a combined cycle power plant. In this case, it has one steam turbine and it also has 3 gas turbine units. So let's look a little bit more in depth into the steam turbine, right? So on the steam turbine, you have the main systems, which are the actual turbine, the generator, transformer, and all that. And then you have another level where we are looking at the actual steam turbine, right? And then the steam turbine in itself has different components. Each component has another level which has a position. In this position, let's say you are having a fixed anchor, right? So in this point, we're saying anything that's in that particular position can be perhaps replaced and moved on, so that they can, for example, if you're replacing a valve or something like that, then you can just move it from this particular position. And then down from that position, you can have the actual assets, the maintainable assets. And then it goes to that level where you can, for example, you're going down to the asset per se. And that way you can have the actual information. So this portion from the number 1 all the way down to the number 1 again would be the actual asset code. Now, notice that, for example, in this case, we're looking at numbers and then letters and numbers and letters and numbers again, right? But notice as well that all the assets that are at this level have the same beginning code, right? So they all start with 10 MAA 12, right? And then notice that the higher level, it's also that particular code. And then higher on the hierarchy, you have another portion of it, and then it goes down it goes up, sorry, all the way to the actual 10, right? So it gives you a little bit more on the tracking, saying, okay, so within this equipment, I go from the actual equipment, from the whole complex equipment down to the detail of the maintainable assets, right? And as you can see, the asset maintains what the actual level or hierarchy is on that particular asset, okay? And that way you can track it and say, okay, so from looking at this, I know it's from 10, and then we'll see a little bit more of what this means. But what you need to know, right, is that in this case, it's a stop valve for the main steam valve for the high pressure steam turbine on the steam turbine, and that way you can go all the way up. Okay, so slideshow, we're looking now at the guidelines. So there are a lot of standard coding systems that you can use depending on your industry. In the case of power plants, there are two specific ones that are the ones, at least in visual case preference, that we tend to use. So KKS is a German classification system which gives it's very focused on power plants. It covers nuclear plants, convention plants, and also a little bit about renewables. So you have a lot of detail there into what the plant components may be. And it's a very extensive and very robust list that I haven't found, at least we haven't found anything that it doesn't really have. Maybe you can play with the structure depending on what makes sense to you guys, but it's very complete. Now that KKS has been transforming in the last few years to what is the RDSPP, which is again another reference designation system for power plants. In that case, they are very similar. They have different functionalities, but you can have either one apply to your power plants. Okay. Now, of course, you can also have your particular set or your particular list of asset coding standards. So let's say you want to track your particular equipment. In that case, you would need to obviously gather a complete list of all the assets that are not only in the plant that perhaps you work on, but on all the sites that are related, so that you can create a standard based on what you have and the operations that you perform, right? And in the case of KKS, they have different ways to organize the data based on how you prefer it, right? But to what we understand, the process related coding system is one of the most complete ones because you have the the different components that give you the hierarchy, the functionality of that asset, and that way you can understand what the asset is just by looking at it. There's also others that are location related or specifically on what position it's at on the plant. Okay, so there's different ways to look at standardized codes, but the reason or the benefit to having a standard code at all is, like I said, you have a way to understand your assets just by looking at their name. Okay, so that way we can do process related or specifically to the hierarchy, and we can decide on that. Okay, so let's look a little bit more into an example. But before we go there, we need to understand that we need to think of it in a very simple way. Because when you have multiple assets and when you're looking at many levels of structure, then you know it's going to get hairy soon, right? So we can try and keep it as simple as possible. Specifically, when you're talking about assets, we we do not go down to the nuts and bolts. We specifically keep the asset registry specifically on the maintainable assets, right? So anything that has maintenance, anything that needs replacement, anything that can be fixed could be an asset. If it's something that you replace and you throw away, then that's just an inventory part, and that's another conversation, right? But let's talk about maintainables for this point, right? The other thing we need to understand is coding systems work great, but you need to identify the coding system that works for your company and, of course, your industry. You're not going to have a power plant based coding system if you're working perhaps on a manufacturing site, right? So those are the types of questions that you need to make before you start establishing a standard code. If you don't find something that suits your industry or your plant perfectly, then obviously this is a guideline which you can customize depending on what works for you. So on the example that we just saw, right, the asset, the valve that we just saw, we are going to break it down now and say, okay, so this is everything that you need to know about this asset based on the code, right? So let's start with the 10. And that's basically your either your plant location ID, or if you're looking at different uh, complex components, then you can say this is going to be your whole system. So in the example, we had steam turbines and gas turbines. Those would be what represent this number right here. Then we have the M in the KKS, and of course, this is information that we can get on the internet. So within the KKS, they have their coding system, which is based on alphabetical letters, and of course, the numbers are specifically to identify your components. Okay, so on the case of the M, it represents main machine sets. When it has a second A, it's representing a steam turbine. And then with the third A, then you would have a whole level, which would say from the main machine sets, you have the steam turbine plants, which has the HP turbine, the high pressure turbine, right? So you have that information within the actual code, and now we go into the second set of numbers, right? So once you have your first number is for the first level, then it explains, okay, so this second level is going to be a high pressure turbine, and then it identifies that turbine. Say you have more than one turbine, then you can have multiple numbers here that you can identify each particular turbine by itself. Then we move to another set of letters which identify the lower level of the asset. So in this case, we're talking about a mechanical equipment, and within those mechanical equipments, we are talking about a specific valve or damper. Okay, so just by looking at this, we can say, okay, so this is a valve that's on the high pressure turbine, and it's also on the steam turbine plant, right? So you have all that information just by looking at these numbers. And of course, like I said before, you are tracking as well the hierarchy based on what the code is. So let's say, okay, so here's a valve for system 12, which is the high pressure turbine for the steam turbine. Okay, so you have that information just by looking at it. And then you have your final asset coding system. So if you have more than one valve, then you can say, okay, so I'm looking at valve number 1, valve number 2, and you have a lot of information just looking at this, and you understand, okay, so level 1 or stage 2, or if you break it down by different stages or phases, then you can see different levels of where the actual component is. Okay, so that's how, and of course the numbers are may be sequential, but if it makes more sense to you guys to use it uh, or based on location or whatever it is, then you can also change that. So the benefit of this is that you have all that information, and also you have a particular ID that is not repeatable, right? So once you have that information, then you are essentially creating a serial number for that particular asset that makes sense for your company. Okay. So moving on, we're going to think about where else we can apply this, right? So, for example, assets can is a great way to start your standardized procedures. But when you have multiple sites and you're looking at multiple information from different sites, it can be very overwhelming very fast, right? So when you're talking about higher level, and I'm talking about the management that is on top of all sites, right? Then you can have a standard code for all the sites, which makes sense for management to interpret and say, okay, so if we're doing, for example, if we're doing the same tasks for the same equipment, are we looking at performance comparisons between the two sites? Are we looking at, for example, on the PM schedules when you're doing your checklist? Are some of the results on this plan very different? You can tell the difference by looking at them from another plan. That type of information you can get out of just looking at the standard task and say, okay, so let's compare performance between those, frequency between those. Uh, is there any other follow-up work order coming from that? And then that's easier to see when you're dealing with the standardized codes. Also, of course, you have the standard work orders. So if you have multiple plans that do the same thing, then it would make sense to have work orders, which are templates that you would select in order to create repetitive work orders in terms of work orders that perhaps are breakdowns. So when you have frequent breakdowns that are exactly the same, and you know what to do and you know what parts to add, then you can just create a work order that is a template, and then it also eases the technicians work by just selecting the standard work order and starting their own job. Okay. So the other thing you can also track and standardize is inventory, warehouse, and stock locations. So when we talk about inventory, it's fairly easy to use a sequential number, and of course that's one of the things that you say, okay, so it makes more sense for me to create an actual sequential number, and that might work. But what happens when multiple sites consume the same parts but have different sequential numbers? And that would be a confusion that would be created based on them seeing different parts. Now, why am I talking about the same part in different warehouses, right? When you have your inventory, right, you might be tempted to create your own parts and manage your own warehouse. But if you're doing multiple warehouse management and you want to have the ability to check on the parts of other warehouses and say, okay, so the availability on the other warehouse can fulfill my own need in for example, in case of emergency, you can have parts shipped into your warehouse, and that way you can have your need or your emergency solved quicker, right? So that type of interaction, if you don't have a standard code, then gets a little bit more complicated. And of course, looking at the stock location, bin numbers, lot numbers, you need to you need to understand that when we are looking at one warehouse, maybe the particular clerk knows every part by heart, and then he or she can manage it, and they can understand whatever it is that's on the warehouse and say, okay, so that's on the way back in that you can go and look for it, right? But what happens when that person is sick, or when you need to have another person come in and look at the inventory, right? So those type of questions, if you have a standardized code for inventory and locations, then can be answered by just, hey, so I have this guideline. If you can't find something, use the guideline and go ahead and find it. So that way you can have anyone manage your inventory and understand what's there and what's not. And of course, when managing departments, multiple sites may have the same departments, even though they are different sites. They have, for example, they have operations, they have maintenance, they have uh, their production site. So there's different departments for that fulfill the same needs. So make sure that those are standardized. And that's probably one of the most common standard codes that's already there, but make sure that within all your sites, you're using the same departments. And of course, when talking about the cost codes, right? So cost codes represent expenses that are focused on a particular expense, right? So before before just having everyone go crazy at the cost codes and have all different types of cost codes, of course you can find some standards online, for example, to establish your cost codes, but make sure that they're the same on all sites so that it makes sense for everyone to do. Okay. So the other thing that we're going to talk, and this is more on next week's webinar, right? And our colleague Luis Echevarria is going to be covering this. But you can do a lot of good things based on what you have and the results of having your standardized assets and standardized codes for all the different modules that we just discussed, right? So you have the ability to perform asset performance management, where you can just check, like I said, you can check performance on uh, different valves. In this case, we can say, and for example, if the exact same functionality and measurements and all that, but the only difference is that they are different brands, then what's happening, right? Who's using better products and is giving me the best performance for that particular asset? So we can look at that particular information. Also, you have the ability to create standardized KPIs. Like I said, when you're analyzing it on your own site, that's fine to use whatever KPI you have. But then if you're reporting to a higher level on the organization, then it's easier to provide the same measurements between each site and say, okay, so each site has the same KPIs. This one's doing better than this one, and you can create a comparable apples to apples kind of comparison between the two plants or three or however many they are, and that way you can measure and understand better. Of course, once you have the information or the data standardized, it opens the door for a lot of more actionable information. So when you talk about standardized, it gives the user or whoever is going to analyze this information a lot more tools to say, okay, so I can use the first three letters of this particular code and say, this part is going to tell me what plant does it belong to, right? And that way you can perhaps break it down so that it makes sense for all the team, and also you can create your own strategies to move forward. Okay. The other thing, of course, that we're looking at is when you're doing your diagnostic and predictive, which is a higher level on your asset management, right? We're talking about if you are doing repetitive and behaviors that are very predictable, then it opens the possibility of interpreting that information with basically a code that just says that information is repeated and I can understand it, and that way you can narrow it down based on that. And when we're talking about AI or artificial intelligence, it really looks at ways to interpret the information in ways that it's repeated or repeatable. It looks for trends, right? So once you have trends on your asset coding, your task coding, your PM coding, that information is very standard, then it's putting a whole new world of possibilities for the particular asset or the particular performance or any other kind of AI functionality that you can look at and say, okay, this is something that can be predicted in the way in the future based on what we've done so far. Okay, so it gives you a lot of powerful tools, and thinking of it on a long term, if you decide to move into AI, then you would like to have all the information of your assets, of your tasks, of all that you've been doing for years, and trying to standardize your asset at that point may complicate the transition from your current corrective and preventive maintenance or and move all the way to diagnostic and predictive maintenance, right? So standardizing is kind of a way to create from the start or from scratch, create your own long-term solution to start thinking about those AI functionalities. Okay, so this is all I had for today, and we'll be taking any questions as they come. So let me know, and I'll look in the chat. And also, here's my information. So if you need to reach me, here's my email, and you can also visit visualk.com for more information. By the way, this webinar is going to be recorded and it's going to be available within the Visual K blog, so you can go there and see this and other very informative webinars and blogs, so we can so you can see what we're up to. So thank you very much for your time and have a nice day.